One of the more controversial chapters that's been often debated in Romans is Romans 13, because Paul is in fact calling us to submit to the governing authorities and to pay our taxes. Now, it's natural for human beings to grumble about people who have authority over you that sometimes seems to be arbitrary, or even to grumble about paying taxes. But Paul didn't want any of that to come out of his Christians in Rome. He, of course, was especially concerned about the fragile nature of the Christian community in Rome. They were not part of a recognized religion, and they were in danger of being prosecuted as a superstition. Indeed, when you get to AD 64 and there's a fire in Rome, it's the Christians who are scapegoated as responsible for this immoral act of arson, when in fact it may have been Nero's own folks doing that so he could rebuild the capital in a way he wanted to. So Paul begins in Romans 13 by talking about submitting to the governing authorities. Among other things, what this means is recognizing they have authority over us. Paul, in fact, says no legitimate authority is held by anyone except the authority that comes from God. He doesn't seem to debate whether the emperor of Rome is a legitimate authority or not. But what he's assuming is that these governing authorities will act according to the law, that they will behave in just and righteous manners. So the presupposition of Romans 13 is a normal state of affairs where governing authorities are doing their duty and not distorting the law or using the law for their own personal aggrandizement, or not perpetrating evil in the name of the law. He assumes what he would hope was a normal situation. All authority comes from God, including these governing authorities, so Christians should not be causing trouble for the Roman authorities. They should live quietly, they should live peaceably with their neighbor as best they can, and they should pay their taxes. One of the questions that's often raised about this is, does Paul say submit to the governing authorities as if that were somehow different than obeying them? Well, yes, I think there is some difference. You can disagree with a particular law and even violate that law because it's against your conscience, and yet still submit to the governing authorities by submitting to the punishment for the crime of having violated a law that you felt violated your conscience. This is what you call conscientious objection to a particular law without being a rebel against the law as a whole. Well, Christians had on various occasions to stand in that very particular way. In ways they could be in harmony with the law, they were to live as good citizens of the Roman Empire. In ways they had to object to the law, if it was egregiously against their faith or persecuting them, they would stand against it. But then they would accept the consequences of their action, and in that way reflect that they were submitting to the governing authorities. Notice that Paul doesn't say submit to every law that the governing authorities have set up. It says instead submit to the governing authorities. That's a slightly different matter. Another important point, sometimes Romans 13 is used as a justification for using weapons of violence against other human beings. You need to realize that in the first place, this text is about governing authorities, it's not about the Christians. What Paul warns the Christians about is that if you don't keep the law, and if you are in fact an evildoer in general, not merely a conscientious objector, but a deliberate breaker of numerous laws, some of which you had no need to break at all, then you should expect the consequences to be negative. He says of the governing authorities, they have a right to bear arms. Now, the arms he's talking about is a sword. He's not talking about bombs or planes or nuclear weapons or AK-47s or any sort of thing like that. But he is saying that the governing authorities have the right to use force to enforce the law. And in this case, he's talking about the tax police in Romans 13. So even the tax officials have the right to use coercion to make sure that the taxes are properly paid. There's nothing there that either encourages Christians to go and enlist and become a Roman soldier or a Roman tax police person, much less become an emperor of Rome. Paul is not assuming that Christians will be serving in some of these kinds of capacities, presumably. But nonetheless, what he is doing is saying that all Christians have a need to respect the governing authorities. One more thing about this chapter before we move on. The second half of this chapter is very much like the second half of chapter 12, in which he returns again to the theme of love. Listen to what he says. Let no debt remain outstanding, that is, you'd better have paid your taxes. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another, for whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery or murder or steal or covet or whatever other commandment there may be, are in fact summed up in the commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to the neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. In Paul's view, there is nothing that should more characterize the behavior of Christians than love. Not just love for one another, but even love for those who persecute you or prosecute you or execute you. Love even for those who don't understand you or reject your message or reject you. The truth of the matter is, friends, that at the heart of all of the ethical codes in the New Testament is love. It is supposed to be our ensign, the trademark value, so that when people see us, they will know we belong to the Prince of Love, Christ.